Hi, I'm Steve, and I am host of the History of the Papacy and Beyond the Big Screen podcasts. In producing these podcasts, I've read a book or two, and I had someone to keep me on track and help me read the classics and the important books of literature in a really systematic way. And that is where intellectual linear progression comes in. This is a program where you can join regular people like yourself who work together to curate a love for reading and building knowledge. Intellectual linear progressions not only helps you build an understanding and love of the great books, they also help you develop the close reading skills that will help you get as much as possible out of these texts. I am really excited to be able to bring you a very unique offer. This is an opportunity for personal growth through great literature and to join an incredible community of learners. In their Zoom online classrooms, your learning is led by an intellectual linear progressions host in a Socratic method seminar with their carefully curated hard copy text delivered right to your home. What I love is that they're not the givers of knowledge. You work together with a team leader and your fellow students to build knowledge and understanding. As a History of the Papacy and Beyond the Big Screen listener, you will receive 25% off your first 3 months. You can subscribe and receive your 25% off your first 3 months by going to intellectuallinearprogressions.com and use promo code PAP. You can sign up at their website, intellectuallinearprogression.com/PAP, and use that promo code PAP to get your 25% off your first 3 months. Go to intellectuallinearprogression.com/PAP to get that great offer of 25% off your first 3 months. So let's learn together on the history of the papacy, Beyond the Big Screen, and intellectual linear progression. The Church in the Dark Ages, Part 9, the Ostrogothic Papacy. Episode 71. Thank you for listening again to The History of the Papacy, an Agora Podcast Network member. Go over to agorapodcastnetwork.com to find more great thought-provoking and independent podcasts. You can learn more about the History of the Papacy podcast at a2zhistorypage.com. We are on Facebook and Twitter, and as a matter of fact, I set up a special Facebook group called A2Z History Page Group or something like that. It's easy enough to find. You can find the link in the show notes and on the website. We've been having some great conversations in the group, so I highly suggest you come in and join the fun. For today, this is the final episode of the Church in the Dark Ages series. We're going to wrap up the period called the Ostrogothic Papacy. This is a time where the Ostrogothic kings up in Ravenna held major sway over the papacy in Rome. As the old song goes, the times they are a-changin'. This is the time antiquity was ending, and we really move into a distinct phase of history, beginning with the Byzantine papacy. All of these terms, Ostrogothic papacy, Dark Ages, late antiquity, Byzantine papacy, etc., are all constructions historians use to make sense of very complicated times. Now, I'm no historian, but I think that's okay. We have to make up a story or make a story and a narrative to make all these interrelated events consumable. Today, we're going to discuss many popes and move pretty quickly through a complicated time so that we can start to focus on new stories and themes. So let's just dive right in. We left off last time talking about Pope Symmachus. I know that's been some time if you're keeping up with the show, but let's quickly show where we have left off and give a peek on where we're going. Symmachus was obsessed with his own power. He wasn't against making up precedents for his power either. Anyway, Symmachus died in July of 514, and his successor, Hormisdas was elected that same month. Hormisdas was of a rich family, and he was possibly of Persian stock, being that his name is of Persian origin. It's also possible he was named after a famous Persian saint of that time, more or less. Hormisdas reigned for almost 9 years until 523. Next up was John I, who reigned for a few short years from 523 to 526. This John could have been a lot of different Johns who were connected to various aspects of the story we told in the last few episodes. He could have been in the pro-Goth or pro-Byzantine camp. After John I was Felix III or IV, depending on the numbering. We'll go with Felix III. It is possible Felix was an ancestor of Pope Gregory the Great, and who will come up in a few episodes. Felix reigned from 526 to 530. There was a 58-day gap between Felix's reign and John's. There was a very difficult battle between the pro-Goth and pro-Byzantine camps to figure out who should be the next pope. Finally, Theodoric the Great, the Goth, forced Felix to be elected, so you know where Felix stood in the whole struggle between Goth and Byzantine. After the death of Felix, Dioscorus was elected. Remember old Dioscorus? He was a deacon from Alexandria who came to Rome and heavily supported Symmachus and the Chalcedonian theological position. Dioscorus rose through the ranks and held many high positions during the papacies after Symmachus. He had strong connections to Constantinople in the east, being that he was an Easterner originally. There was quite the controversy because Felix named Dioscorus as his successor, which was a big no-no. Naming a successor PO'd a lot of the clergy. They just got angry right off the bat. Despite all that, Dioscorus was still elected. One way or the other, Dioscorus died less than a month after his election. Boniface II was elected right after Dioscorus. Boniface II was almost pope during the election a few weeks earlier against Dioscorus, but he just lost out. Boniface's reign mostly involved with getting even with people who had voted for Dioscorus and then trying to do the same thing Felix did in selecting Dioscorus. He tried to select his own successor. Boniface tried to handpick his successor and just created a huge storm. Then he had to back down from that. Boniface's chosen successor was a man named Virgilius. His name's going to come up again, so definitely keep that one in the back of your head. Boniface was, for 2 years, pope. He died in October of 532. It took nearly 3 months for the next pope to be elected. Pope John II took over in January of 533. The election was just another big mess. There was bribery, infighting, all the things that make for a great papal election. A little note on John II. He was actually the first pope to take on a new name. John's original name was Mercurius, and he may have changed his name because it sounded a little bit too pagan. Anyways, John got along well with the Goths and the Byzantines. Justinian, the emperor of Constantinople, brought him in on an interesting issue or two that we'll get into in a bit. In 535, Agapetus was elected pope. Agapetus is another possible ancestor of Gregory the Great. Agapetus was forced to go as an ambassador to Constantinople by the Gothic king. He was forced to hawk church property to just pay for his travel costs. That's how bad finances were at that point. Agapetus had some adventures in Constantinople and even died there. The news of Agapetus' death in Constantinople must have just spread like wildfire because the people in Rome found out fast. A Roman aristocrat and son of former Pope Hormisdas was elected in June 536, just a few months after Agapetus died. And this is showing you that even at this point in Roman papal history, not only are clergy getting married and having legitimate heirs, bishops, high-ranking bishops, are having children and legitimate heirs. Now, whether it's possible that he was born before Hormisdas became a clergy member, I don't know. There's a lot of different possibilities there. But just keep that in mind. There's a lot, the rules on clerical celibacy are a lot looser back then than they'll become, and not too many years after this point in history. This next Pope, Silverius's major selling point for becoming Pope is that he was selected by the King of the Goths, Theodahad. Otherwise, he really wasn't qualified in any other way. Silverius had a quite unhappy ending in November of 537. A lot happened in Silverius' short reign. He was sent to Constantinople to try and smooth things over, especially for the Goths. But he was drawn into this whole politics of Constantinople, whereas they were trying to get him to basically officially stamp the Monophysite position. The Empress Theodora was behind that, and he was trying to waffle on that. And he was sent, when he went back to Rome, this next Pope, Virgilius, had already taken over. And he's like, you know what, Silverius, you're not coming. And poor Silverius was just shipped off to a small island in the Tyrrhenian Sea off the coast of Italy. And he wasn't put up on a big villa there. He was basically just sent there to die, and that's what he did. And that was in November of 537. And that's really where we're going to end with the timeline of the popes. And now we're going to jump out a bit because I really breezed through a lot of these popes. We're talking about like 8 popes in 23 years. That's an average of less than 4 years per reign. And out of all that, one pope, Hormisdas, had a reign of 9 years. I thought I'd give you a quick rundown of the popes because there are a ton of big issues to talk about that happened in this 23-year time span. This will more than likely be the last episode in the Church of Dark Ages series. Part of the reason is because this time period really marks the end of the classical world. Something different came out of the other end of this Gothic wars. The church changed, the papacy changed, and really Western Europe changed. Interestingly enough, the Gothic wars, the point in time when the Eastern Roman Empire reconquered large tracts of the old Western Roman Empire, is suggested by some scholars to be the real point when the Roman Empire in the West completely fell, fell. Forget all about that 476, and there are some really good reasons for forgetting about 476. In the big scheme of things, nothing much changed in the year 476. The Ostrogoths carried on pretty much the exact same administration as the former Western Roman Empire did. In fact, most of the administrators were the same people. Some of the trade networks had broken down, but that was happening all over the place and had been happening for some time. The amount one would feel that there was a big break in the mid to late 400s would be in a gradient of sorts. In some places, like Great Britain and North Africa, an older person born in, say, the early 400s would have noticed a big difference. In other areas, like southern France, a person who lived in that same time frame would have noticed that very little changed. It became more difficult for people to obtain certain trade goods, and the types and volumes of communications they were accustomed to were much less, but otherwise things weren't too different. You could also say that travel and the ability to travel long distances had been started to shrink, and that is true. The Italian peninsula and Sicily could be put into that later scenario in the late 400s and early 500s. Maybe Goths were running the show. Maybe the Goths were Aryans and spoke a different language. But life carried on, and much like it had for a long time previously. That was all changing in the 6th century. A whole host of factors were about to change, which will seriously upset the whole situation in Italy. We could talk about politics, war, disease, plague, and changes in climate and social structure. But most of those are outside of the scope of the history of the papacy and Christianity. You can listen to Wittenberg to Westphalia, the history of Germany, Tides of History, the history of Byzantium, and other podcasts, which will fill you in on a lot of the detail of all these changes and aspects from a lot of different perspectives, and they can do it much better than I can right here. These different factors are very important, but for our purposes, they are the catalyst that turned the Roman papacy into a political force. For the first few centuries of Christianity, the Roman papacy held an important place in the wider world, or at least the Mediterranean Roman-wide Christianity, as far as defining Orthodox theology and practice. The popes had to fight and scratch for that authority, though. There was a great deal of competition in this area. The early 500s was the beginning of the development of political power for not only the popes, but bishops in general in Western Europe. And this is a topic that I spoke and did an entire episode with Ben Jacobs on, specifically about political and warrior bishops. Initially, the popes were the pawns of greater powers. They had virtually no political power in their own right. In the scope of this episode, the popes were pushed around by the various powers, be it Goth or Byzantine. The popes had a hard enough time enforcing their ecclesiastical rule around their patriarchate in the West. This period from 514 to 537 was the prelude to the Great Gothic War. Well, you could say the prelude in the very beginning of it, even though there was a lot of interesting events in the very beginning of the Gothic War. The Goths and the Byzantines went back and forth militarily and diplomatically. More diplomatically earlier, more militarily later. The Goths eventually will be defeated, and tossed on the scrap heap of history after these Gothic wars, but someone standing in the early 500s might not have guessed that would happen. It looked like the Goths might create an empire of their own in the Western Mediterranean. Monophysitism was never much of an issue in Western Europe, but it was a huge issue in the East. Remember, mono or miaphysitism was the Christology that said that Christ had essentially one nature, a divine nature that overwhelmed his human nature. Now, that's a gross simplification, of course. We talked about this Christology extensively in previous episodes. The western end of Europe was dominated by the Chalcedonian Diophysite position. This Christology stated that Jesus had both a fully human nature and a fully divine nature. Pope Leo of Rome laid out the official version of this Christology in his tome. Leo didn't invent this idea of Christ being fully divine and fully human, but he popularized it and put it into a really digestible form in his tome. The Chalcedonian Diophysite position had its followers in the East, but in the early 500s, the emperor of the East, Anastasius, was a dyed-in-the-blue monophysite. Despite being a monophysite, Anastasius wanted to end that Acacian schism that we talked about in earlier episodes. Anastasius wanted every Roman to play nice for unity's sake. That was important. In the end, Anastasius and Constantinople couldn't broker an end to the schism. It took major changes in the regime to get this done. In 518, a man named Justin took over the imperial throne. Justin made his name in the East, but he was a Westerner, having been raised in Illyria. He spoke Latin, and he was a Chalcedonian Christian through and through. Justin ended the Acacian Schism and made Chalcedonian Orthodoxy the official Christology of the land in the East. Not everyone in the East loved that, but the popes in Rome sure enough did. A big issue with the Acacian Schism is that part of the way that the popes got this issue put out of the way, and the emperor got this issue put out of the way, was affirming Canon 28 of the Council of Chalcedon, and the popes accepted that. Now, in short, let's review what Canon 28 is. Following in all things the decisions of the Holy Fathers, and acknowledging the canon, which has just read, of the 150 bishops, beloved of God, who assembled in the imperial city of Constantinople, which is New Rome, in the time of the Emperor Theodosius of blessed memory. We also do enact and decree the same things concerning the privileges of the most holy Church of Constantinople, which is New Rome. For the fathers rightly granted privileges to the throne of Old Rome, because it was the royal city, and the 150 most religious bishops, actuated by the same consideration, gave equal privileges to the most holy throne of New Rome, justly judging that the city, which is honored with the sovereignty in the Senate and enjoys equal privileges with old imperial Rome, should, in ecclesiastical matters, also be magnified as she is, and rank next after her, so that in the Pontic, the Asian and the Thracian dioceses, the metropolitans only, and such bishops also of the dioceses aforesaid, as are among the barbarians, should be ordained by the aforesaid most holy throne of the most holy Church of Constantinople, every metropolitan of the aforesaid diocese, together with the bishops of his province, ordaining his own provincial bishops, as has been declared by the divine canons, but that, as has been above said, the metropolitans of aforesaid diocese should be ordained by the Archbishop of Constantinople after the proper elections have been held according to custom and have been reported to him. This canon is a huge deal. Rome never put its power, especially as its power of first among equals amongst the patriarchates, on anything that Rome was the capital of the Roman Empire or any of that. They laid their leadership role in that they were founded by the two big apostles, Peter and Paul, and that Rome was given this special authority by being the see of St. Peter. Now, Alexandria could claim something like that since that was a see founded by Peter. Jerusalem could certainly claim some sort of special power, and absolutely Antioch could claim some certain status as being founded by an original apostle. But forget all that. With Constantinople, Constantinople is saying that, you know what, this power of ecclesiastical supremacy does not come from apostolic foundation. It actually comes from, it's issuing from the political authority. Old Rome's old Rome, and nobody cares about old Rome anymore. Constantinople is the center of the universe, and you can't have the Bishop of Constantinople playing second fiddle to anyone. And that's really where that stood. And this is going to be a big fight for a long time, especially since the popes at this point in the 530s had to put their stamp on this canon, which they did not want to do and which they hadn't done at the time in the 450s. So keep this is another one to keep in your mind. Another big issue that came up in this time period of the late Ostrogothic Papacy is a situation between Pope John II and Hormisdas. This is a situation where it's an interesting theological position and it's an interesting ecclesiastical political issue it's an issue in a situation of one pope overruling the rulings of another pope. The big issue was over something called the Theopascite formula, and it was a formula of a religious doctrine developed by these people called the Scythian monks. They were called the Scythian monks, but they were actually Goths from the Romania area, not Iranian Scythians, who we've heard, if you do a lot of reading at the time, these are different Scythians. A lot of people, if you were just born in that area that was basically anything north of the Black Sea, you were just called a Scythian no matter what you were. These Scythian monks were actually founded in Constantinople, but a lot of them had moved to Rome, and they had really strong ties with the popes, especially Pope Gelasius, if you remember him from way back. One monk was named Dionysius Exiguus. I'm not exactly sure how to say that. That sounds pretty good, but that last name Exiguus actually just is the Little, so he was Dionysius the Little. He's one of these interesting monks, not so much for this Theopascite formula, but he's the one who invented the Anno Domini time scale, the AD that, or what more scholarly call BCE, and CE, the Common Era, but the Common Era really just lines up with AD. But anyways, this AD slowly in Rome replaced the old ad orbe condita from the founding of the city time reference scale that was used in Rome. Basically, year 0 was the founding of the city of Rome. So in Rome in the 530s would have been around the year 700 something. This AD also replaced other dating systems that had come into effect later on. A common one that of a dating reckoning was started year 0 at the end of the Diocletian persecution. So then at this point in the 500s, you're only at like year 200 something. But let's go back to the Theopascite formula. This is what it all really boils down to, is the Scythian monks wrote something that one of the Trinity was crucified. Hormisdas completely rejected this wording, but John II accepted this doctrine full-hearted, and this may have been partly to keep the emperor happy in both circumstances. Basically, Hormisdas completely rejected this wording to keep an emperor happy, and John II accepted it to keep an emperor happy. The emperor at the time was happy with John II because the Monophysites loved this language of one died in the one of the Trinity was crucified. The Monophysites liked that wording because it was really cutting the legs out from under the Nestorians, who were actually, even after all this time when Nestorianism had been officially rejected a couple of councils previously, if you go back to previous episodes, Nestorianism was always trying to squeak its way back in, and it still had a lot of followers just on the eastern border of the Roman Empire and what's modern day Iraq, Iran, and in the Arabian Peninsula. And that's actually, if you keep that, and that's another one to keep in the back of your mind, because that one's going to come up in a couple of future episodes, not too in kind of distant future episodes. All of this talk and this real struggle between Monophysites and Nestorians and these Chalcedonians being pulled and pushed and pulled in the middle is all basically going to come to a head in the 5th Ecumenical Council that will happen in a few years, and that we'll probably get into maybe in next episode or a little bit in the episode after that, where these Nestorians are really going to be ended as a power player in the Roman Empire, and even anything that remotely has a whiff of Nestorianism is going to be pushed out, and it's really going to swing that imperial church position, Chalcedonian position, more towards the Monophysite direction than it does in the Nestorian position. If you took, say, the Tome of Leo completely on its own, it definitely gets more of a feel that it's going in a Nestorian way. But in later years, the Tome of Leo, Monophysites do not, even to this day, a lot of them don't like the Tome of Leo. The only way the Tome of Leo is even remotely okay is if it's seen, basically read through a lens of Cyril of Alexandria's works. It is kind of complicated, but it's the whole thing is the church getting pulled into this Monophysite direction. A little bit earlier in this time frame we set up, if you're a Goth like Theodoric, who is trying to set up a Gothic empire in Western Europe, where he is allying himself with the Burgundians and getting them pulled into his hegemony, and you're tying in the Vandals in North Africa, and you're tying in the Visigoths in Spain, and you're even trying to pull in the Franks into this Gothic empire. He needed several things. He needed the Byzantines off of his back to get this to happen, but the Goths were always just a veneer on top of a very, very Romanized population, especially in these areas of Spain and Italy and southern France, and even to a certain respect in North Africa. They were a ruling class, and they did a lot of things to keep themselves separated. They held on to their Gothic language, but they weren't forcing other people to drop their Latin to learn Gothic. They kept their Arian religion, and for the most part, they did not force people to become Arians, and they didn't even, Theodoric, especially in his earlier reign and through most of his kingship of the Goths, he didn't do anything that would remotely be considered a persecution of Catholic Christians, Trinitarian Christians. That would change, though, as the Byzantine Empire was putting more pressure on to the Goths and Arians, which there still were a lot of Arians in the East. Don't forget that. That's something to keep in your mind. We're not done with Nestorians or Arians at all, not in the least bit. And those Nestorians and Arians in the eastern section of the empire, Justin and Justinian are starting to put the pressure up onto them, turning the heat on them. For the lack of a better word, they were persecuting them. Theodoric's starting to have enough of this, and he's threatening to persecute Catholics in Western Europe, which is giving even more of a casus belli for the Byzantine Empire to interject themselves into Western Europe. They're coming in and saying, hey, look, we're the saviors. We're Catholic Trinitarian Christians, and we're Catholic Trinitarian Roman Christians, and we're going to come into Western Europe and give these Goths, Arian Goths, the boot and make a one whole Roman happy family again. You can obviously see how the tensions are definitely building up here. To use Zach Twomley's podcast, we're seeing that diplomacy is failing. Let's look at 527 for a second. Justinian takes over the empire from his uncle Justin. These were staunch Chalcedonians and an obvious ally to the popes. And this shifts and raises the ecclesiastical power of the popes. The popes are feeling pretty good that there is a staunch Chalcedonian as the emperor in Byzantium, in Constantinople. That had not always been the fact. In fact, it had been quite the opposite of that. Obviously, the popes didn't have a lot of the concern, so there is a difference in objectives here. The Constantinople constantly had to worry about keeping monophysites balanced. There were so many more monophysites, and they were very geographically entrenched. They had certain geographies in the Middle East. They had a huge following in Egypt. They had followings in other parts of the empire, and in just outside of the empire, in a place like Armenia. That was a monophysite. They were leaning monophysite. The West, the popes didn't have those issues, so they didn't quite care to compromise as much. And all of these concerns, monophysites and the politics and the balancing of what the Pope needed to balance and what the Emperor needed to balance, are going to really heat up as we move on into our next bunches of episodes. Now, I've jumped around a bit in this episode. I really had to play with the format a lot in this particular episode. There was so much going on in a really short amount of time. I think you've got a good rundown of what was happening. In short, the Pope's ecclesiastical power was fairly weak. They didn't have really strong control over all of their bishops. The popes were continually stuck in the middle between the Ostrogoths and the Byzantine Eastern Roman Empire. They tried to balance between the two powers, but that became more and more difficult. The Ostrogothic leaders started very slightly to put the squeeze on the Catholic Church and the Catholic people, but that trend never got going fully. There are a lot of reasons for this. Arianism was the religion of the Gothic elites. It was never pushed on the Catholics as a general as their population. The Goths wanted to keep themselves separate from the Roman population as much as possible. We don't see a ton of Catholic bishops being replaced by Gothic Arian ones. The Gothic Arians had their bishops, and the Catholics had their own. The Roman aristocracy stayed Roman and stayed Catholic. The Gothic aristocracy tried hard to stay Gothic and tried hard to stay Arian, but that kept getting more and more difficult. Some Germanic people were breaking Catholic, and individual Gothic and Germanic leaders were also going Catholic. We will see this trend continue and come to full fruition in upcoming episodes. Speaking of upcoming episodes, I'm thinking this will be a good time to take a short little intermission and look at a few issues and concerns that are running parallel to the course of Roman papal history. They're sort of feeding into Roman papal history, and we need to understand those to understand what's going on in the mainstream or the main current of papal history. Certain things like the Fifth Ecumenical Council, the conversion of the Franks, the reintroduction of Christianity in Britain, and much more. The popes are involved in differing degrees to this. Then we'll go into the story of the time when the Byzantines ran the show in Rome. Good times to be had. And as always, if you have questions, comments, concerns, episode ideas, things that you'd like to see in a little bit more in depth, or things that you know what you're saying, hey, you know what, I don't care about this. Maybe we can try and steer around these different aspects of history. A huge shout out, of course, goes to our Rome level patrons, Peter the Great, Mary Carmen, and Seth the Magnificent. I want to thank our Constantinople level patrons on patreon.com/papacy, Sandy, Andy, Paul, Dr. Jeff, Robert, Sean, Yoren, and Molly, as well as our Alexandria level patrons, Francine, Richard, and Justin. I can't express to you how much Patreon is a great way to support the show. It's every day it gets harder and harder, it seems, to make these episodes. There's so many different distractions and costs involved, and costs of time, which time is probably the most precious quantity of them all. But supporting the show through iTunes reviews, Patreon, sending in emails and questions and comments, All that makes it so much more motivating to keep this show going. So if you want to learn about Patreon and the different levels of support you can do, you can go over to patreon.com/papacy. I always add a book or two onto my Amazon wish list for the history of the papacy. So if you're on Amazon and you're just feeling like, oh, I'll maybe throw one more thing into my cart, you could maybe throw one of those materials in there. And the link for that and the link for all of these things can be thrown in the show notes. With all of that, I just really sincerely appreciate you listening to the show and taking time out of your busy day and the other podcast listening options that you have. And as always, I look forward to seeing you on our next step on our trip through the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church.